Right now, as you listen to this, nearly 100 million Americans, which is, more than a quarter of the entire country's population.
Yeah, it's a massive demographic.
Right. They are walking around with a very specific type of generational wealth.
Generational wealth and just overall stability, really.
Exactly. And it's all built on a single massive government giveaway.
The biggest one ever.
Yeah. Today, for this deep dive, we're looking at literally the largest transfer of land in human history.
The Homestead Acts.
Homestead Acts. It is a story that involves 160 million acres of dirt.
Which is hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. And we'll get into the construction of America's first mosque, a pretty devastating legal loophole that weaponized real estate, and basically a fundamentally flawed map of opportunity.
It is arguably the defining engine of American westward expansion. I mean, we are talking about 10% of the total land area of the United States.
10%?
Yeah. Roughly 250,000 square miles handed over to private citizens.
Between 1862, and this is the part that always gets me, 1986.
It's wild that it went on that long.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you're here with us, you are someone who, isn't satisfied with those surface-level textbook summaries.
Right, the stuff we learned in middle school.
Exactly. We all know that cinematic painting of the pioneer, right? The covered wagon, the golden wheat, the stoic white family standing in front of a log cabin.
The classic myth.
That is the myth. So our mission today is to take a towering stack of historical sources and crack that painting wide open.
Which is going to be fun.
Very. We're going to look at the actual people who navigated these laws, the women, the immigrants, the black tenant farmers.
And we're going to contrast their wild, surprising successes with the systemic exclusions they faced.
Right. And of course, the overarching tragedy of the Native Americans whose land was actually being distributed.
You really can't talk about one without the other.
No, you absolutely can't. Okay, let's unpack this. Because a law that gives away 10% of a continent doesn't just happen in a vacuum.
Definitely not.
It was the product of a vicious, decades-long ideological war.
Yeah, the Homestead Act of 1862 is the famous legislation, but the battle over the public domain started way before the Civil War.
Way before.
It actually originated in the North as the free soil policy.
Right.
So Northern Republicans in the 1850s had this very specific vision for the expanding Western territories.
And they were pulling directly from Jeffersonian democratic ideals, weren't they?
Exactly. They wanted the land completely available to the working class. Their ideal citizen was this concept of the virtuous yeoman farmer.
The yeoman farmer, which basically means an independent operator owning and working his own modest plot of land.
Right. A guy who answers to no one, feeds his family, and contributes to the economy.
So let's look at the political mechanics of that. If you are a northern politician trying to build a nation of independent, small-scale farmers.
Which sounds great on paper.
Right. But your absolute worst nightmare is a competing economic system that relies on massive land monopolies and, frankly, unpaid enslaved labor.
Yes. Which means you are on a direct collision course with Southern Democrats.
Right. Because their economy was totally different.
Completely different. The Southern economy was driven by wealthy planters whose entire wealth generation model required constant expansion.
Because tobacco and cotton deplete soil rapidly.
So rapidly. You can't just farm the same plot forever with those crops back then.
So they needed new land.
Exactly. These planters needed the western lands open for outright cash purchase so they could buy up enormous tracts, move enslaved people onto them, and just replicate the plantation system.
In the new territories.
Yes.
So if you're a listener, imagine this political standoff. The Southern lawmakers in Congress look at the free soil movement and see an existential threat.
Absolutely, because if the government starts handing out free 160-acre plots to working-class people, it floods the West with European immigrants.
And poor northern whites.
Right, and those people are going to form free states.
Which changes the math in Congress.
Exactly. They will eventually send anti-slavery representatives to Washington, completely and permanently tipping the balance of power against the South.
Which they couldn't allow.
No. Because of that, Southern Democrats repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly successfully blocked homestead law proposals.
Didn't they even get a president to veto one?
They did. They managed to get President James Buchanan, who was a Northern Democrat but very sympathetic to the South, to veto a successful homestead bill in 1860.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a complete legislative deadlock.
Until the Southern states seceded in 1861.
Right.
I mean, the moment the Confederacy is formed, those Southern Democrats just pack up and leave the United States Congress.
The opposition simply vanishes from the room,
Poof, gone.
leaving the Republicans and their Unionist allies in total control of the legislative agenda.
So without the planter class there to block them, President Abraham Lincoln signs the Homestead Act into law on May 20th, 1862.
And it officially goes into effect on January 1st, 1863.
You know, the audacity of the timing is just staggering. The country is tearing itself apart in literally the bloodiest conflict in its history.
Yeah, the Civil War is raging.
And Lincoln is signing a bill to give away a tenth of the landmass for, what, a $10 filing fee?
A $10 fee and 5 years of sweat equity.
Sweat equity. I love that term. But I have to push back on this framing immediately.
Okay, go for it.
We cannot talk about free land without addressing the ledger.
Right.
This land wasn't just sitting empty, waiting to be claimed by these virtuous yeoman farmers.
What's fascinating here is the foundational cost of this entire enterprise, because the overarching reality dominating our sources is that the homestead laws inherently and severely depleted Native American resources.
That is the core of it.
Right. The government could only distribute 160 million acres because they were actively engineering the dispossession of the people already living on it.
It is the tragic baseline of this entire deep dive.
It has to be.
Like every story of resilience and success we are about to cover takes place on land with a prior owner.
Exactly.
So how was the government, legally justifying this massive transfer into the public domain?
Well, the primary mechanism was treaty negotiation.
Treaties.
Yeah. But we have to look closely at the power dynamics of those treaties. Native ancestral lands had already been limited through earlier allotments and the reservation system.
Right.
So the government would approach a tribe to negotiate land cessions in exchange for promises.
Promises of what?
Citizenship, annuities, or civil rights.
Which sounds like a standard legal contract until you look at the actual leverage.
Right.
I mean, the United States possessed overwhelming economic and military superiority. The tribes were essentially negotiating at gunpoint.
That's a very accurate way to put it. Furthermore, indigenous people lacked basic legal rights and standing in the U.S. court system at this time.
Oh, right. So they couldn't even sue.
No.
Yeah.
If the government broke a treaty, which, by the way, happened constantly, a tribe couldn't just sue the federal government in federal court.
Because they had no recognized mechanism to challenge the infringement.
Exactly. These treaties were ostensibly framed as a way to, quote, naturalize and civilize Native Americans.
But the practical result?
The practical mathematical result was millions of acres of tribal territory transferred into the federal public domain, ready to be carved into 160-acre squares.
It's devastating. And the pressure from the settlers themselves often outpaced the legal paperwork, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Homesteaders would just push into indigenous territory while it was still legally occupied.
Which creates conflicts.
Right, which creates conflicts that the government would then use as an excuse to deploy the military.
To wage war and force further removal.
Exactly. The Homestead Acts were the engine driving that displacement.
So keeping that crucial context in mind, let's look at how specific populations navigated this newly created machinery of land distribution.
Let's do it.
We know the Southern Democrats fought the acts to protect slavery. But I want to look at how Black Americans interacted with a system that was, well, initially built to exclude them and later aggressively marketed to them.
Yeah, to understand the African American experience on the frontier, we actually have to look at legislation that predates the famous 1862 Act.
Okay, what are we looking at?
Specifically, the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act of 1850.
1850. So this applied to the Oregon Territory, which was massive back then.
Huge. Modern-day Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming.
Right.
The 1850 Act was, at the time, the most generous land distribution bill in U.S. history.
How generous?
It allowed white settlers to claim 320 acres, or up to 640 acres for married couples.
Wow.
Yeah. The government was practically begging people to move to the Pacific Northwest.
Why? To solidify American claims against the British.
Exactly. They even guaranteed land for half-breed Indian men in the territory who met certain conditions.
But the sources highlight a glaring, legally codified exclusion here.
They do.
The 1850 Oregon Act explicitly barred Black citizens from owning land and real estate in that territory.
It was a deliberate racial lockout. I mean, while white families were securing 640-acre foundational estates that would generate wealth for generations.
Black Americans were legally prevented from participating.
Yes. in the primary wealth-building mechanism of the era.
which had to have profound, lasting negative effects on the demographics and economic equality of the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, absolutely. You can still see those demographic shadows today.
But after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the legal framework flips, right?
It does. The federal government looks at the South, sees a massive population of newly freed, completely impoverished, formerly enslaved people, and tries to use land distribution to fix it.
Which brings us to the Southern Homestead Act of 1866.
Right. The 1866 Act was a targeted legislative effort. The goal was to dismantle the remnants of the plantation economy.
By allowing poor tenant farmers and sharecroppers to become landowners.
Exactly. And unlike the Oregon Act, the 1866 law explicitly included Black Americans.
Okay, so on paper, that sounds incredibly progressive.
On paper, yes.
The government is stepping in to provide a pathway out of sharecropping. But the physical and economic reality on the ground was a nightmare.
A total nightmare.
Let's look at the mechanics of what was actually being offered to these people.
Well, the land made available under the Southern Homestead Act was mostly undeveloped forestry in states like Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama.
Undeveloped forestry. I want to pause and really think about what that means for a farmer in 1866.
It's brutal.
Yeah, this is not a flat expanse of Kansas prairie where you can just hitch up a plow and start turning soil. This is a dense, old-growth southern forest.
Right. And to prove up a claim, you have to cultivate the land.
But to cultivate a forest, you have to clear the trees.
You need heavy steel axes, cross-cut saws. You need draft animals to pull the stumps, chains, seed.
And perhaps most importantly, you need enough stored food and capital to survive the months or years it takes to clear the land before you ever see your first harvest.
Exactly. Which means the only people who could actually utilize this, quote, free land were people who already had capital.
And newly freed Black Americans, who had been systematically robbed of their labor and wealth for generations, did not have capital.
They had nothing.
It's a completely hollow offer. It's like giving someone the blueprints to a mansion and telling them it's theirs if they can build it in 5 years,
Yeah,
but making it illegal for them to own a hammer.
that's a great analogy. That lack of capital was the primary filter. But even if a Black applicant managed to scrape together the resources, they faced an openly hostile system.
Hostile how?
The sources detail rampant discrimination and deliberate bureaucratic inertia.
Give me an example how that bureaucracy operated as a weapon. Because I think people assume it's just slow, not malicious.
Oh, it was malicious. The local land offices were often staffed by former Confederates or Confederate sympathizers.
Wow. Okay.
So an African-American applicant would come in to file their claim or pay their fees, and the officials would simply refuse to process the paperwork.
They just refuse.
Or they would lose the files. They would assign the land to a white applicant instead. The 1866 Act included lower prices to supposedly help the working class, but even a few dollars for filing fees was an insurmountable barrier.
Especially for someone trapped in the sharecropping system, where the plantation owner controlled all the currency anyway.
Exactly.
So you have dense forests requiring heavy capital, a local government actively sabotaging the paperwork, and a population starting with less than zero wealth.
And yet,
the historical record reveals something absolutely astonishing.
it really is. Despite every deliberate systemic barrier constructed against them, the Southern Homestead Act did yield incredible results for Black Americans.
Tell me this stat, because it blew my mind.
Within a single generation after its passage by the year 1900, a full 1/4 of all Southern Black farmers were farm owners.
25%. 1 in 4 Black farmers in the South owned their own land by 1900. When you consider the physics of what they had to overcome, clearing forests by hand while fighting off a hostile bureaucracy, that statistic is a testament to an unimaginable level of grit.
It's incredible. It demonstrates how desperately marginalized groups sought land ownership as the ultimate guarantor of autonomy.
And they weren't just staying in the South, right?
No, African Americans were utilizing the 1862 Homestead Act to move into the West and the Great Plains as well.
We actually see this documented by the people who lived it. Oscar Micheaux is a perfect example.
Oh yeah, Micheaux is fascinating.
Most people know him as a legendary pioneer of early Black cinema. But before he was making movies, he was a homesteader in South Dakota.
Right.
He wrote a semi-autobiographical novel in 1917 called The Homesteader. It offers a deeply personal look at the specific lived experience of an African-American pioneer striving on the plains.
Fighting the elements and the social isolation.
Exactly. But as we look at the African-American experience on the frontier, the the sources introduce a profound historical contradiction that we have to address.
Yes. And that involves the Buffalo Soldiers.
The all-black regiments in the U.S. Army serving in the West.
Right. The Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental in building the infrastructure of the American frontier.
They strung telegraph lines, protected settlements.
And maintain order, yeah. But their primary directive from the federal government was often to engage in military campaigns against Native Americans.
Oh, man. The sheer tragic irony of this is heavy.
It's very heavy.
You have recently emancipated black men, joining the military as one of the few avenues available to prove their citizenship and secure a living wage.
Yeah.
Being ordered by the government to violently dispossess indigenous people of their land.
And that very land is then transferred into the public domain, where it might be homesteaded by other African Americans fleeing violence in the post-Reconstruction South.
It shows how the machinery of the Homestead Acts entangled different marginalized groups, forcing them into adversarial roles based entirely on the government's mandate for expansion.
It completely obliterates that neat little pioneer painting we talked about at the start.
It really does. The reality is messy, it's painful, and it's built on a complex web of survival.
Absolutely.
So we've established that the government was more than willing to legally lock out specific races to control the demographics of the frontier.
Right.
But when you look at the exact same legislation, you find this bizarre, almost accidental contradiction when it comes to gender.
This is one of my favorite parts of the history.
Right. Because while they were writing exclusions for Black and Asian Americans, they left a massive legal loophole wide open for women.
It is one of the most surprising progressive elements of 19th century law.
So where did it come from?
To trace its origin, we actually have to go back to that deeply racist 1850 Oregon Land Donation Act we just discussed.
The same one that barred black citizens.
The very same. The 1850 Oregon Act contained a fascinating legal mechanism regarding property.
What was it?
It allowed the donation of up to 400 acres of land and stated it could be claimed by the heads of households.
Okay.
And legally, Congress allowed that definition to include women.
Think about the timeline here. For anyone listening, remember that women did not get the right to vote nationwide in the United States until 1920.
Right.
Yet here we are in 1850, 70 years earlier, and the federal government is recognizing their right to claim 400 acres of prime real estate in their own name.
It's wild, and that legal concept carried directly into the landmark Homestead Act of 1862.
What were the specific requirements there?
They were straightforward. You had to have never borne arms against the U.S. government.
Which was a clause specifically aimed at locking out former Confederates, obviously.
Exactly. And you had to be either 21 years old or the head of a family.
And the sources explicitly confirm that single women, widows, and deserted wives legally qualified under those definitions.
They absolutely did. They could claim the 160 acres.
But I have to push back on the political logic here.
Okay, let's hear it.
The entire free soil movement was built on the ideal of the virtuous yeoman farmer. And that ideal is deeply rooted in a traditional patriarchal family structure. You know, the father plows the fields, the mother tends the hearth, the children labor.
The classic nuclear family of the 1800s.
Exactly. So if that was the ideological goal, why write a law that empowers single, independent women to build their own wealth outside of marriage? It seems entirely counterproductive to their social engineering.
It's an excellent point. And the answer lies in the harsh physical mathematics of settling the frontier.
Okay, explain that.
The sheer demographic desperation of the federal government simply overrode the strict Victorian gender norms of the era.
Meaning they just needed bodies on the ground.
Exactly. The government's primary goal was to occupy and cultivate these vast Western territories as quickly as possible.
To secure them economically and prevent foreign encroachment?
Right. So if a widow with 3 children was willing to travel to the Dakota Territory, build a house out of prairie sod, and cultivate 160 acres of dirt,
The federal government was not going to stop her just because she didn't have a husband.
survival and expansion trumped patriarchy. Period.
The necessity of settlement created an accidental avenue for liberation.
It really did. Single women could generate wealth and achieve a level of legal and financial independence on the plains that was almost entirely unavailable to them in the industrialized cities of the East Coast.
It drastically changes how we should view pioneer history. I mean, pop culture usually centers the family unit led by a patriarch.
Always.
We all know Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie series, focusing on Pa moving the family, or Willa Cather's novels like Oh Pioneers.
Right, but while the family unit was certainly the most common arrangement, the legal framework guaranteed it wasn't the only one.
Because women were proving up land entirely in their own names, acting as the main characters of their own homesteading narratives.
And doing it successfully.
And what's truly mind-blowing is how long this loophole stayed open.
Oh, this is a great story.
Right, this isn't just a quirk of the 1880s. Let me introduce you to Elizabeth Klaus Smith, who went by Betty. According to the records, Betty Klaus Smith became the last woman homesteader to successfully prove up land in her own name.
And this took place in Alaska, correct?
Yes, she was part of a group that filed for homesteads west of Big Delta, Alaska. She received her patent for a 116-acre claim.
And what was the date on that patent?
October 18th, 1984.
1984.
The legal mechanism created by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War was still actively empowering women to claim wilderness land during the Reagan administration.
The longevity of the law is just incredible.
It's unbelievable.
And if women found their opportunity through the head of household clause, there was another massive demographic that used the Homestead Acts.
Right. Not just to acquire property, but to forge a new national identity.
Exactly. For immigrants, the Homestead Act functioned as a powerful, incredibly effective engine for American citizenship.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you were guessing what the requirements were for the 1862 Act, you'd probably assume you had to be a United States citizen to receive a massive grant of federal land.
Which would make sense.
Yeah.
Right, but you didn't.
No, you didn't. The law explicitly stated it would give 160 acres of surveyed public land to citizens or intended citizens.
Intended citizens. What are the mechanics of that? How do you prove intent?
It was remarkably simple. You didn't have to pass a civics test.
Okay.
You didn't have to speak English. And you didn't have to wait through a years-long probationary period.
So what did you do?
You simply had to file a legal declaration stating your intent to become a U.S. citizen. Once that piece of paper was filed, you were eligible to claim the land.
It is arguably the greatest marketing campaign for global migration in human history.
It really was.
Come to America, say you want to be one of us, and we will hand you a 160-acre farm.
And the global response was monumental. It created a wildly diverse mosaic of communities popping up across the Great Plains.
Because the traditional narrative focuses heavily on, Scandinavian, German, and Irish immigrants.
Right. But the sources detail several unique, less discussed groups drawn by this exact promise. This part of the research really surprised me. Let's look at the Jewish homesteaders.
Yeah, the sources note that approximately 1,200 Jewish immigrants utilized the Homestead Acts to settle in North Dakota.
Wow.
These were largely Russian Jews who were fleeing the violent state-sponsored pogroms in the Russian Empire.
So they're fleeing literal persecution and finding a haven in the freezing expanse of the Dakota Territory.
It's a massive culture shock.
Did they remain farmers? Because I know the transition from Eastern European urban life to plains agriculture had to be brutal.
It was incredibly difficult. The sources indicate that while they proved up their claims, many of these Jewish homesteaders eventually moved to nearby towns.
Right, transitioning back to more familiar trades.
Yes, but the key is that the land provided that crucial initial foothold.
A foundation.
Exactly. It was a foundation of equity and safety in a new country that allowed them to transition into other trades and businesses.
It was a springboard. And it wasn't just European refugees. The act was pulling people from the Middle East as well.
We see significant numbers of Syro-Lebanese Muslim settlers utilizing the act.
And where were they settling?
They gained land, proved up their claims, and created a thriving settlement in Ross, North Dakota.
And what did they build in Ross, North Dakota?
The sources confirm they eventually founded the first mosque in the United States.
The very first mosque in the United States was built by Muslim homesteaders on the plains of North Dakota.
It's such a great detail.
It completely shatters the homogeneous image of the West. You have Russian Jews, Middle Eastern Muslims, and the sources also highlight a strong Hispanic and Latino presence.
Yes, the frontier saw an influx of Chilean and Mexican immigrants claiming land.
Alongside U.S.-born Latinos who moved north from places like New Mexico into Colorado to establish homesteads.
You had this incredible convergence of cultures, religions, and languages, all united by this single legal mechanism of land ownership and the declaration of intended citizenship.
But, as we've seen throughout this deep dive, wherever the government opens a door, they usually build a wall somewhere else. We have this relatively open policy for European Jews, Middle Eastern Muslims, and immigrants from the Americas. But there was a stark, deliberate contrast when it came to immigrants from Asia.
It is a crucial racially motivated limitation.
Right.
While all those other groups could legally declare their intent to become citizens, the sources make it explicitly clear that very few homesteaders were Asian during the 1800s.
Explain the legal mechanics of that, because if the rule is simply declare your intent, why couldn't an Asian immigrant just sign the same piece of paper?
Because of how the Homestead Act interacted with the Naturalization Act,
Okay.
the Naturalization Act at the time explicitly denied the possibility of citizenship to people of Asian descent.
Ah, I see.
So, legally speaking, an Asian immigrant could not file a declaration of intent to become a citizen because federal law forbade them from ever actually achieving it.
It is a vicious, impenetrable legal catch-22. The government says, you can have land if you intend to be a citizen, but we've passed a separate law stating you are permanently ineligible for citizenship, so you get no land.
Exactly. It was a racial barrier constructed entirely out of overlapping paperwork.
Which effectively barred an entire continent of people from participating in the largest wealth transfer in American history.
But that barrier was eventually broken, not by Congress, but by the courts.
Walk me through the legal breakthrough.
The turning point was a landmark Supreme Court case in 1898, United States v. Wong Kim Ark.
What were the mechanics of that decision?
Well, Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco to Chinese parents. After a trip abroad, he was denied re-entry to the U.S. on the grounds that he was not a citizen, despite being born there.
Okay.
The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, formally establishing the principle of birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment.
Meaning, if you were born here, you were a citizen.
Right. They ruled that any child born in the United States to parents of foreign descent is a U.S. citizen by birth, regardless of their parents' race or eligibility for naturalization.
And how does that ruling interact with the Homestead Acts?
Well, by affirming birthright citizenship, the Supreme Court instantly bypassed the Naturalization Act barrier for the next generation.
Because they didn't need to declare intent. They already were citizens.
Exactly. The sources note that the Wong Kim Ark decision finally opened the Homestead Acts to Asian Americans. Because they were now recognized as full citizens from birth, they were fully eligible to claim public land just like anyone else.
It perfectly illustrates how inextricably linked property rights and citizenship truly were. You could not have one without the other.
No, you couldn't.
Which brings us to perhaps the most complex, heartbreaking intersection of property and identity in this entire narrative.
Yes. We've explored how immigrants fought for inclusion in the Homestead Acts. This raises an important question. How did the original inhabitants of the land navigate a legal system that was quite literally engineered to replace them?
Right. We know the original 1862 Act excluded Native Americans entirely because they were not considered citizens.
Correct.
But Congress eventually realized they needed a legal framework to manage the indigenous populations who were being pushed off their lands, so they passed the Indian Homestead Act in 1875.
And on the surface, much like the 1866 Act for Black Americans, the 1875 Act sounds like an expansion of rights.
On the surface, sure.
It gave Native family heads the opportunity to purchase homesteads from the public domain. But there was a cruel, deeply assimilative condition attached to it.
Explain the catch. What was the requirement?
To qualify for a homestead under the 1875 Act, a Native American applicant had to explicitly, legally relinquish their tribal identity and relations.
Wow, let that reality sink in for a moment.
It's hard to process.
Compare the experiences. A European immigrant arrives, signs a paper saying they intend to be a citizen, and they get 160 acres. They get to keep their language, their religion, their culture. They can build a mosque in North Dakota.
Exactly.
But a Native American, whose ancestors have lived on the continent for millennia, is told they must legally renounce who they are. They must renounce their family, their tribal nation, and their heritage.
Just for the opportunity to buy back a microscopic 160-acre fraction of the land that was violently taken from them in the first place.
It is the ultimate forced assimilation policy, codified directly into property law.
The government was using land as a weapon to eradicate indigenous culture.
And beyond the profound emotional and cultural toll, the system was rigged with severe financial mechanics designed to ensure failure, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Let's break down those financial mechanics.
What did it cost a white settler to homestead?
For a white settler under the 1862 Act, the financial burden was designed to be minimal. You paid a $10 filing fee, lived on the land for 5 years, paid another $8 final fee, and the 160 acres was yours.
$18 total.
Yep. But for a Native American applicant under the 1875 Act,
What was it for them?
The U.S. government flatly refused to issue fee waivers for Native Americans.
Even though they had been displaced and impoverished by the government itself.
Exactly. Many of these applicants were non-reservation natives living in extreme poverty caused by that displacement. They simply could not afford the filing fees to claim the homesteads.
So even if you were desperate enough to renounce your tribal identity to secure a future for your family, you were priced out by a government refusing to waive a $10 fee.
And if you somehow found the money, you faced a bureaucratic nightmare.
Of course.
Access to homesteads was chronically complicated by constant delays. Our sources point out that this was largely due to deep discord and infighting between two federal agencies.
Which agency?
The U.S. Land Office and the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
You have two government agencies fighting over jurisdiction, and the native applicant's paperwork is just sitting on a desk gathering dust.
Exactly. And while the native claims were stuck in bureaucratic limbo, it made it incredibly easy for white settlers to move in and finalize their claims on the exact same land.
So the system was functionally designed to fail the indigenous applicant.
100%.
But the federal government didn't just use homestead laws to deny Native Americans land. They used it as a strategic tool to permanently alter the geopolitical map well into the 20th century.
Yes, this involves a phenomenon the sources call late homesteading.
What does that mean in a strategic context?
Well, by the early 1900s, the American frontier was largely considered closed.
Right, the prime agricultural land was gone.
But the U.S. government continued to actively encourage homesteading in specific, contested areas as an indirect, de facto way to secure dispossessed land.
Secure it against whom?
Against indigenous tribes attempting to reclaim it or maintain their traditional practices.
Oh, wow.
The government knew that if they flooded a contested area with white homesteaders and handed out legal titles, it created a permanent physical barrier.
By allowing late homesteading, they were actively solidifying settlements to disrupt tribal land practices.
And insulate the government from legal backlash or tribal reclamation efforts.
It is weaponized real estate. You use your own citizens as a demographic buffer to permanently lock in the dispossession.
It proves that the Homestead Acts weren't just an agricultural program. They were a primary aggressive tool of statecraft.
And speaking of that agricultural program, as this incredible diverse mosaic of settlers rushed to claim the land, they ran into a massive physical problem.
The geography of the available land was changing drastically.
Because by the early 1900s, the prime real estate, the low-lying, fertile alluvial land along the rivers in the Midwest had all been claimed.
Right. The 160-acre model worked beautifully in Ohio or eastern Kansas where it rains.
But as the settlement engine pushed further west into the arid Great Plains, 160 acres was a death sentence. It wasn't enough land to support a family using traditional farming methods.
Congress recognized this ecological reality and realized they had to alter the deal.
To keep the machine of westward expansion running.
Exactly. They had to push homesteaders into increasingly marginal, dangerous environments. And they did this by passing a series of amendments to increase the acreage.
Give me the mechanics of those amendments.
Okay, so in 1904, Congress passed the Kincaid Act.
And what did that do?
This was targeted specifically at the sandhills of north-central Nebraska, which is an incredibly fragile ecosystem. The Kincaid Act granted massive homestead tracts up to 640 acres.
4 times the original amount.
Right. Recognizing that the soil was so poor, you needed vast amounts of it just to survive.
And then what?
And then in 1909, they passed the Enlarged Homestead Act. This was aimed at enabling dry land farming on marginal lands across the Great Plains that couldn't be irrigated.
How much land did that give?
It increased the standard homestead from 160 to 320 acres.
They are essentially trying to bribe people to farm the desert. It's like a developer selling off all the luxury waterfront properties. And when they run out, they try to sell you a plot and a toxic swamp by telling you it's a great deal because they'll give you twice as much swamp.
That is exactly what it was. It was a recipe for disaster.
And there were earlier acts too, right?
Yeah, like the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916, granting 640 acres for ranching, and the Timber Culture Act of 1873.
What was the Timber Culture Act?
It gave 160 acres to anyone who promised to plant trees in a bizarre attempt to artificially change the climate of the plains.
They truly believed that rain follows the plow, that if you just keep farming, the climate will magically accommodate you.
They really did.
But let's look at the actual ecological mechanics of what happens when you push thousands of farmers onto the Great Plains with the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909.
The sources are clear on the catastrophic sequence of events here.
Right. The 1909 Act led to a massive influx of new, inexperienced farmers onto the plains.
They accepted these 320-acre tracts of marginal, dry land, and they brought their traditional farming techniques with them.
And those techniques involved heavy steel plows. I want to use an analogy to explain why this was so devastating.
Go for it.
Think about a concrete wall. On its own, concrete is brittle. What gives a concrete wall its structural integrity is the hidden grid of steel rebar inside it.
Right, the reinforcement.
Exactly. The Great Plains had its own natural rebar, the incredibly deep, dense root systems of the native prairie grasses.
Those roots had evolved over thousands of years to hold the topsoil down against the fierce prairie winds.
And then the homesteaders arrived.
They combined a total misunderstanding of that delicate ecology with highly inappropriate cultivation techniques.
They used those steel plows to rip up millions of acres of prairie grass.
They sliced right through the rebar.
The topsoil looked fine for a few years while the rain lasted, but they had completely destroyed the structural integrity of the land.
So when the inevitable severe drought hit in the 1930s, there was absolutely nothing holding the earth down.
Nothing.
The sources directly connect the influx of homesteaders driven by the enlarged Homestead Act to immense land erosion, which culminated in one of the greatest man-made ecological disasters in human history.
The Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl.
The soil simply turned to powder and blew away in storms that literally blacked out the sun all the way to the East Coast.
It was terrifying.
The government gave away the land, but they fundamentally misunderstood the physics of the environment, and the homesteaders paid the price. Did the Dust Bowl put an end to the Homestead Acts?
It slowed the agricultural distribution massively, but the concept of homesteading didn't die.
Really?
Yeah, during the Great Depression, there was actually a renewed interest in a different kind of land distribution under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal.
How do you homestead during the Depression if farming the plains is a failure?
You change the scale.
Okay.
The government implemented programs for subsistence homesteading. A key piece of this was the Small Tract Act of 1938.
What were the mechanics of the Small Tract Act?
It allowed citizens to obtain much smaller pieces of federal land, usually not larger than 5 acres.
5 acres. That is a massive shift from the 640 acres of the Kincaid Act.
It was a totally different philosophy. It wasn't meant for massive commercial farming. It was designed for residence, recreation, or small business purposes.
So what did you have to do to prove it up?
To prove up a small tract claim, you had to improve the property by building a structure. By 1955, the government required a minimum 400-square-foot building.
Okay, so like a cabin.
Exactly. In places like the Mojave Desert in California, these became known as jackrabbit homesteads.
Jackrabbit homestead?
Yeah. It was a way for regular working-class citizens from places like Los Angeles to get a tiny piece of the public domain, often building quirky weekend cabins.
But eventually, the federal government decides it needs to stop giving away the country. When does the book finally close on the Homestead Acts?
The official end comes in 1976. Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or the FLPMA.
What was the political shift that drove the FLPMA?
Well, by 1976, the environmental movement was in full swing, and federal policy had fundamentally changed.
They realized they needed to protect the land.
Exactly. The government no longer wanted to dispose of the public domain. They wanted to retain control of the remaining western public lands for conservation, recreation, and managed resource extraction.
So the FLPMA officially repealed the Homestead Acts in the contiguous United States.
In the contiguous U.S., yes, meaning there was one final exception.
Ah, Alaska.
Yes. The law allowed homesteading to continue in the vast, unsettled expanses of Alaska for another decade, until 1986.
Which brings us to the very end of the timeline. Past Betty Clow Smith in 1984, all the way to the very last homesteader in American history.
His name was Ken Deardorff.
Ken Deardorff. According to the records, Ken made a claim for 80 acres of land on the Stony River in southwestern Alaska.
He lived there, he built his cabin, he fought the brutal Alaskan winters.
And he fulfilled all the rigorous requirements of the Homestead Act in 1979.
But the federal bureaucracy moves at its own pace.
It certainly does. Despite fulfilling the requirements in 1979, the paperwork was delayed for nearly a decade.
Unbelievable.
Ken Deardorff didn't actually receive his official deed until May of 1988. He holds the historical title as the last person ever to receive a land patent under the Homestead Acts.
That's wild.
From Daniel Freeman, the very first claimant in Nebraska in 1863, to Ken Deardorff in Alaska in 1988, a 125-year experiment in giving away a continent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the legacy of that 125-year experiment is almost unfathomable in its demographic scale.
Give me the final number. What is the legacy?
As of 2017, the sources calculate that around 93 million living Americans are direct descendants of people who received land through the Homestead Acts.
93 million people.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? We've been unpacking this for an hour, diving into the deep end of the historical mechanisms. And we've seen that the Homestead Acts weren't just a simple, benevolent giveaway to a homogenous group of plucky farmers in covered wagons.
Not at all. It was a vastly complex, deeply flawed, and highly engineered mechanism of wealth generation and demographic control.
It was a law that empowered single women to claim true independence on the frontier.
It provided a literal, physical refuge for Russian Jews fleeing violence and Middle Eastern Muslims who built the first mosque in America.
It offered a brutal, obstacle-ridden, but ultimately successful path to land ownership for 1/4 of Black Southern farmers trying to build a life post-slavery.
But we must weigh all of that against the overarching cost.
We have to.
It achieved all of this while simultaneously and systematically disenfranchising Native Americans, forcing them to abandon their tribal identities for a fraction of their ancestral homes,
Locking Asian Americans through naturalization loopholes.
and pushing desperate settlers into ecological disasters like the Dust Bowl.
It is the ultimate American paradox wrapped up in 160-acre parcels. So I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over, a thought that builds on everything we've just discussed. Think back to that painting we started with. The pioneer family, the golden wheat, the clean image. We've cracked that painting wide open today. We know the reality was infinitely more complex.
It's more complex.
But consider the math. If 93 million Americans, more than 1/4 of the entire population of the country today, are descendants of homesteaders, they are the direct inheritors of the generational wealth, the geographic stability, and the social mobility generated by this massive 10% land giveaway.
Right.
When you consider the specific deliberate hurdles we've discussed, the naturalization laws blocking Asian immigrants, the lack of fee waivers and forced assimilation for Native Americans, the bureaucratic inertia and lack of capital hindering Black tenant farmers trying to access that exact same free land, you have to ask yourself a very difficult question.
It's the most important question.
How much of the modern American map of wealth, opportunity, and inequality was permanently drawn by the fine print of the Homestead Acts?
It's a question that the history of the frontier demands we ask.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions.